Okay, so we're 2 minutes past the hour. I think we can go ahead and dive in. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Mindy O'Gara, the Director of Product and Learning Experience at Interface, and I'd like to welcome you to Adaptation. This is a 3-part series brought to you by Interface on what we've been learning from COVID-19. I think we could all agree that over the past 3 months, things have been pretty tough. You know, these are complex times and there's a lot of uncertainty. But we're here to plant a stake in the ground and to say that, you know, we don't have all the answers, but we do know that global disruption requires systemic solutions. So we've teamed up with our extended family and some new colleagues to bring you the Adaptation series. Why? Because we believe the time is now, and we're the industry to drive the process of change. Now, in the past episodes, we focused on the implications of COVID-19 on our planet, as well as our industry. But today, we'll be turning the lens towards how the pandemic has impacted the individual. I'm joined today by our panelists, Dr. Christina Banks of the Interdisciplinary Center for Healthy Workplaces, Oliver Heath of Oliver Heath Designs, and Joe Connell of Perkins & Will. But before we dive in, there's one housekeeping note. At the end of this discussion, we'll open up for questions. So if you have one along the way, go ahead and post it right in the chat feature and we'll be ready to go. So let's get started. Now, to our panelists, would each of you briefly tell our audience a little bit about yourselves and what you do? In fact, Christina, you want to go ahead and start?
Sure. Thank you so much. I'm very excited to be part of this panel, and I'm anxious to hear what my fellow panelists have to say. I'm Christina Banks, and I direct the Interdisciplinary Center for Healthy Workplaces. It's a center that was started in 2012, and it was designed to aggregate all known science across diverse fields with respect to employee health, well-being, and productivity. The idea is to understand what we know and also understand what we don't know, and then do something about that. So I'm an industrial organizational psychologist, which most people roll their eyes when they hear that, because what is that? So I'm coming from the perspective of a psychologist. So I'm anxious to talk with all of you about how to make things better for individuals.
Great, thank you. Oliver, you want to go next?
Yeah, thank you. Again, it's an absolute honor to be here today in amongst such distinguished speakers. So my name's Oliver Heath. I run an architectural and interior design practice in Brighton in England. We focus on human-centered design, and in particular, the sort of science and style of biophilic design, which essentially is how we improve the human connection to nature in the buildings that are so important in our lives. In my design practice, we are slightly unusual in that we have both a research section where we compile and collate research, and we've written a series of white papers alongside our partners Interface over the last 3 years, all around developing the understanding about biophilic design and how it can enhance the neuroscience, but also the socio-psychological approaches to how nature can bring us and connect us together. As well as that, I run a design department in which we implement these ideas of biophilic design and look at how we can enhance that connection to nature as a means to reduce stress and aid physical and mental recuperation.
Thank you. Joe?
Good afternoon, everybody. Glad to be here. My name is Joe Connell. I'm a design principal at Perkins & Will out of the Chicago studio, and I focus on workplace. In workplace, we all think of workplace as the office, the place where knowledge workers do most of their work. And that's true. That's the bulk of what I do and what I practice. But in fact, the office also occurs in hospitals and in higher ed and science and technology labs. So the workplace covers lots of different industries, but probably most of the time it's what we consider an office in a central business district, and predominantly for professional service employees. I come at this from a perspective of really looking at everything as a system, this is the great thing about this whole series, is that actually it's all interconnected. I went to school at Southern Illinois University, where Buckminster Fuller was the philosopher in residence, and he instilled in everyone that was there at that time that Everything is a system. It's all related. So in thinking about one part, you have to think about as many as you can. That's what's great about this panel and actually this whole series. But while it's about the individual, I'm also representing, I'm usually hired by an organization and advocate for the individuals inside those organizations. So I want individuals to be effective in their work. And if they're effective in their work, the organization can be effective in their work. And that's the balance between the two that I'm always working on.
Great. So as you guys can see, we have quite a lineup, really good contributors here. So let's go ahead and get started with some of the questions. Since this episode is about the individual, I think a good starting question is what have been some of the biggest impacts on the individual during this time?
I'll go ahead and start. Since the individual has really been the center of my thinking at the Interdisciplinary Center, and what's important about the individual is to understand that individuals have basic human needs. It's not talked about that much, but it's essential for understanding what well-being and then health in general is all about. And so when we talk about what's been lost during the pandemic, is a basic satisfaction of human needs has been lost. And the avenues towards satisfying those needs has been lost. So let me be specific. The most obvious thing that we can say has been lost is autonomy. Since autonomy is one of those basic human needs where we want to be the decision maker, we want to make the choices, and that has been taken away from us for most of us, if not all of us. And another aspect that's been lost is our loss of physical and psychological safety. That has been really at the forefront of our thinking on a daily basis. Will we get sick or not? Will we be exposed someplace or not? So that's that sense of safety has been lost. And then the third thing I would mention is the social isolation, which came with physical isolation. The social isolation has been devastating to us because we have a very strong need for belonging, for that social interaction. So the net result of this is that without this need satisfaction, the predictable result is a sense of fear, anxiety, distrust, in some cases depression, and exhaustion from overwork. So we're hearing more and more about the mental illness conditions that people are experiencing, and we're wondering where it's from. Well, this is where it's from.
If I can jump in at that point, talking at it from a spatial point of view, it's clear that we've all been spending an awful lot more time at home, and as a result, we've had a real reduction in our spatial experience over the last 3 to 4 months. In any normal time where we would be living at home and then commuting to work and maybe going to shopping malls or centres, theatres, cinemas, bars, cafes, restaurants, we were having an enormous variety of spatial experience. And suddenly it's shrunk. We're suddenly at home, we're surrounded by our 4 walls, and it's put an enormous pressure on our domestic situation. So now, of course, we're recognizing much, much more about the implications, I think, that buildings have on us, on our physical and mental and emotional states. And that's being demonstrated by the symptoms that are caused by that. I think we're seeing more and more reports on the impact of people's sleep as a result of home working, extended hours, trying to juggle sort of working and family life, the fact that we don't have any separation physically between how and where we work and our family life, so we don't have that kind of disconnection. Sort of disruption through continued use of technology. So for a number of reasons, there's been a disruption of our circadian systems. We're not being able to get out as much, and as a result, we're not as alert and awake as effective in the daytime, and also not able to sleep quite as well. So there's going to be sort of long-term knock-on health effects because of that. So sort of ultimately, much, much more pressure on the home to deliver on our physical and mental well-being. And we're recognizing that. And I think some of the lessons we've learned from how we connect to sort of vital support systems, essentially nature, has become more and more evident.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, I would add that the economic uncertainty is a big part of this stress issue, and related to the connections that we have with colleagues is change. It's not gone, but it certainly is not there. And very difficult for people young in their career that have a very limited network of people to reach out to. Mentors and mentorees are having more challenges. So that kind of support that you're speaking of is missing. And I think something very significant is, one of the things we love about work is there's parts of our work that we get joy from. And that often is celebrated at work with our colleagues where we've had some triumph, a big win, a big completion, whatever. So those celebrations are not part of our life. Similarly, on the personal side, you both spoke about sort of this narrowing of life events. We don't have we're not dining out with friends. We're not traveling as much. And significantly, a big number of our life events have been put on hold. Sadly, funerals, weddings, christenings, all of these things that are life moments that usually bring joy, or at least are important for us to be together. Those are gone, and that gets to that uncertainty and to that stress and that loss and isolation that even Christina was speaking on.
Yeah. Can I just say on the plus side, because it is all really negative, isn't it? I mean, there were so many bad messages. On the plus side, we're here, and I'm in England, you're in America. In any given week, I'm speaking to architects and lecturing people in New Zealand, Australia, India, Southeast Asia. I mean, the way technology has stepped in to connect us is incredible. I mean, it's not without its problems, and nobody has 5, 6, 7 Zoom calls a day without having some sort of ultimate exhaustion or kind of blackout by the end of it. But it is incredible how these technologies have just stepped in and connected us and given us all these opportunities such as this one. And I think that is a kind of a remarkable positive.
And what's created that is the urgency to talk to experts and exchange information and figure out, what do we do? How do we manage this? The thing is, can we carry that forward? This interaction with people who are coming from different perspectives, or are we going to snap back to the way it was, which is, just focusing on what we need to do? One of the things that we have lost, again, getting back to the lost theme, is that the spontaneity that Joe was talking about. How much of your day is spent in spontaneous conversations with somebody over a Zoom call? Or, it's kind of oxymoron, a Zoom call being spontaneous at all, because you have to structure it, schedule it, make sure you can find all the people you need to talk to. But we have lost the equivalent of water cooler time. And some people may not be old enough to know what that means, but we need the equivalent, and it's essential for business to have that, because one of the key ingredients to creativity and innovation is actually bumping into people who are outside of your network of friends and acquaintances. So we've got to think about how we bring that back, because that gives us inspiration, and it gives us a better perspective on our own lives.
Yeah, even that diversity, right? From activity to even conversation. I guess I never really thought about how important even just the casual acquaintance at the grocery store conversation is important in the scheme of things. So thank you.
We're already seeing the breakdown of the restrictions that have been put in place to keep us safe, because people can't stand it any longer. They got to get out, they got to interact with people, and that's going to exacerbate the problem even further. And it's just that need to connect with people, the need to experience positive emotions with people, whether it's being in a garden, a park, with friends, at a bar, at a restaurant. It's just a very strong pull.
I think the clue to the answer is actually in that. in that we can still facilitate that, but these things are going to have to be happening outside and not in enclosed situations. We're going to have to be becoming much more creative, I think, with our architecture, and imagining that architecture isn't just something that keeps the elements out, but something that actually contains us in a new way that allows us to have these basic human interactions.
Yeah, I'm really depending on you too to come up with the answers, because I think there's just so much potential with the built environment to solve a lot of the problems that we're experiencing right now. So can we get outside the box and really think creatively about what we can do to make, truly make a mark in positive human experience? How can we do that? I'm anxious to hear from both of you.
Oh, well, I mean, I think it's easy enough in the summer to imagine that we can be using outside the exterior spaces in and around buildings and look for those little pockets that allow us to get out. I think the trouble is going to come when we get to the winter months, when our architecture just doesn't facilitate it in the same way. I think, in the United States, the domestic architecture is far better at allowing people to sort of have some of those softer boundaries between interior and exterior spaces, with the kind of covered porchway areas. In the UK, it tends to be just, a wall, a door, you're in or you're out, and that's it. But I think we're going to have to become much softer, much more flexible, and have these kind of slightly more ambiguous spaces that facilitate, good, clean, fresh air, that allow us to have the social distancing without the sort of containment of air and proximity to people.
Well, and I'm optimistic that the workplace will evolve to support those more humanistic tendencies. The reason to go to the office has often been that there's a place to focus, there's a place to get together, there's a place to innovate, there's a place to celebrate, there's a place for respite, there's a place for learning and teaching. And I think we need much more malleable environments, frankly. And I'm one that's really a champion for this notion that even when we get into winter months, that a 6-foot distance is not a problem for connection. We've all sat across from each other across a large conference table or across a fire pit and having a glass of wine or a beer. That's still a meaningful, unplanned, that's a win. We can do that inside, and we need to do that inside. And the destination of the office is going to be more for making those connections as opposed to the place where it's heads down and all focus. There will be a change in balance, and should be. But I'm optimistic that the office will be part of that sort of salon experience and need to be for culture building, spontaneity, and connection.
Great. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about well-being. That's been a topic that we've all heard for quite some time, and it will continue to be essential as we move forward. But another topic that is equally important, especially right now, is resiliency. How we manage through and adapt to new situations and even adversity. So how do we build resiliency into our lives and our workplaces to help achieve wellness?
I'll take maybe a first run at that.
Okay.
You're right that the wellness and well-being came out first really of this heightened awareness of sustainability, a more expansive view of sustainability, then into wellness, which initially started off as more active design, more movement, better ergonomics, then into well-being where it took in mind and body, and healthful, everything from healthy materials to light views, etc. And now mental health, right? So all of those start to feed into to behaviors, and the built environment, the workplace, all built environments are nothing if not a prediction about behavior. So one way that we think about being resilient is to design for multiple futures. That is, envision many more behaviors happen in these settings that we're creating, whether they are for small or large groups, for different infrastructure, different uses, different days, over different time periods. So I think being resilient means designing for multiple futures and for planned and unplanned events. And if anything, we have an unplanned event here. It doesn't mean, though, that these disruptive moments can't be a way to usher in some innovation too. So I think that's one way that we think about resiliency, not as being handcuffed, but in fact actually having opportunities that we are more resilient, agile, nimble, and as people and as space types. So I do think we need, as individuals, we need to be nimble. That will make our organizations, our employers, our clients be more resilient, and that ultimately is a sustainability strategy.
Go ahead, Oliver.
Okay. Well, in my mind, resiliency is sort of human-centered subject, and as Joe mentioned, we've been considering more and more some of these human-centered design aspects within buildings, air quality, water, how and what we eat, sleep, movement, acoustics, thermal issues. But there's one other that I think is so fundamental and is going to be in the future, and that is our human connection to nature. This idea of how we integrate green infrastructure into our lives. And this needs to come at it not just from the individual space that we surround ourselves in, but we've really got to take an urban approach to this, and in a way consider how we connect to nature and our nature diet. So when I talk about our nature diet, it might be as if we consider the very top of the pinnacle of how we restore ourselves and become resilient enough to deal with the everyday stresses and strains is by going on holiday, spending time in beaches and forests and mountains. But of course, that's expensive. We have to take time off work. There's a high carbon footprint associated to it. So what we need to do is find ways of integrating elements and moments of nature into our cities, into our neighborhoods, our streets, surrounding our buildings, and then actually allowing this sort of nature connection into our buildings through biophilic design, so that we actually have a constant drip feed of well-being, that it doesn't need to just be something that we do for 1 or 2 weeks a year, but that we find ways of mitigating and managing our stress levels, of recognizing when we become fatigued, both physically and mentally, and finding ways and opportunities to get out and surround ourselves in nature to reduce that stress and to aid recuperation.
Yeah, I'm so glad you talked about what biophilic components can do to people, because it's key to understanding what is happening inside the body, and why it has such a dramatic impact on us, why it's so important to integrate it into our daily living. So I'm going to get geeky for a minute and talk about, what is happening in our body that builds that physical and psychological resiliency, because that's really the point. You can have resilient space, but it's got to have that the boost of resiliency in people. It's so important to our ability to fight off infection, the virus, and stress, and other disruptions in our lives. So let me get geeky. All right, so what we need to do is reduce the frustrations that harm our bodies, and to boost the good stuff that actually boosts our happiness and our resilience in well-being. So let me talk about 3 different systems which are key. And the first one is the nervous system. The nervous system controls our homeostasis, so our ability to be in control of our environment by regulating our body systems. And this is through an electrochemical stimulation. And we know this well because that nervous system puts us in a state that either is productive or not productive, depending on the situation. The endocrine system we know well because that is the secretion of hormones, which can be good or bad, but the ones that we are familiar with are cortisol, the stress hormone, and epinephrine, which is the adrenaline response that creates the fight or flight response to our environment. We need to have more of the endorphins in our lives, which are the key to our happiness. And the last one is our immune system, which produces cells and proteins that defend the body against invaders, viruses, and so on. So these are really key systems that we need to pay attention to. So the question is, how do we get them to work in the manner that really keeps us healthy and gives us that sense of well-being? Well, we do that by designing the environment that produces these results, and biophilia is a key one, but predictability is another, and social connection is another. And so if we, we were in trouble before the virus happened, right? We had extreme stress in the workplace. So let's not carry that forward. The great thing now is that we have a moment to get through to the decision makers that keeping people healthy and in a state of well-being is actually the pathway to productivity and all good stuff in our society. So how can we design for positive emotions, for all of these components of our life that removes the barriers to happiness and positive emotions and promotes those emotions both in the workplace and at home? So let's see how we can do that.
That is one of the great challenges, because as individuals, we all have a different sense of balance about those things. So what some people find exciting and some people find stressful, right? So our most frequent strategy for allowing that to happen, Christina, is really to give people variety and choice, tools and trust in their workplace. And it's more self-regulated. Without trust, none of it works. So organizations that have trusting intentions, palms up, some transparency, genuine and honest communication, then there's a chance for all of those things to happen. But self-determined. If anything, we've learned right now there's very little road rage, right? I mean, that's a good thing. You eliminate the negative, very little road rage. But that variety, choice, tools, and trust, it seems to me, because we all are seeking different things at different times. I find something very stressful, but a commodities trader finds it very exciting. So
Right.
So we have all, we're human beings. We have very different stress levels and sensitivities to certain situations.
Right, what you're hitting on is a key concept, which is it isn't about things, loading a workplace full of things. It's really about how people interpret those things. It's our interpretation. So that's why having human-centered design and to have the things, well, biophilia is not something that, most people debate. They get out in nature and nobody says, I can't stand this. It's really, this is wonderful. Because it attaches to a primitive area of our brain and actually produces a result that's been built into us for thousands of years, maybe more than that.
I think the complex thing here is how we interpret that. And we all know that if we spend time in a beautiful, natural, diverse forest, we're going to feel great. It's such a rich, multi-sensory environment. And then when we step into architecture, so often design is misused. I feel embarrassed that so often design is used as a means to express extrinsic messages of power and wealth and status. And what we're now seeing is the sort of reversal of that and to a more intrinsic approach of going, well, how do I literally design the best possible place for somebody to sit quietly and work and focus? How do I design somewhere where somebody can just have a little one-to-one conversation or feel that they can call a partner? Or how do you design a creative space? What does that look and feel like? I think increasingly at the moment, we've had to accept that there's going to be more trust going on between organizations and individuals because people are working from home. There's just got to be, there inevitably has been a greater level of trust across the world. I've got clients in Japan for whom they would never consider working at home, but now they've had to. And so there's a sort of enforced level of trust, and now an acceptance that people are working, they are being productive. For some people, it's great because they don't have distractions. For other people, they're just going out of their minds because they don't have those social interactions. And I think you know, we're going to have to work harder at how we enhance those social connections and that sort of sense of creativity, particularly if we have extended lockdowns, and if not, how we introduce that sort of multi-sensory quality that we experience in nature, and add that sense of diversity into the workplace to facilitate that range of spaces, but also the range of experiences, to allow these kind of interpersonal connections, to have creative conversations, to have these sort of occasional bumping into each other, sort of water cooler moments. So I think there's an awful lot going on, but I think this intrinsic approach of how do we design to put people in a better, more open, more optimistic, more creative state is a really exciting one. And I think from all this chaos is going to come innovation that's going to have to make this sort of thing work.
How can we get the users more upfront in the design process? I know that there is always consultation, but how can we do this better?
Well, it's happening. You know, this is happening on the street. Sorry,
I would say the truth is that the organizations that can hire our firms are fairly enlightened, and they know where the leverage is. The leverage is that they need their people to be their best, to bring their whole person with good insurance, with good safety nets, with comfort, with security, and that they will bring their best. And if they can give them choices, so those people can self-determine, then they have satisfaction on their settings, satisfaction on their enclosure, on their temperature, on their light, their access to outdoors. That's the best, right? Sadly, that's just a slice of the top of the total number of workplaces. Yes. So the hope, of course, is that by looking at best in class, that it does start to trickle down. The knowledge trickles down. There is some knowledge transfer. I actually think this might be a chance for workplace to be in a period of glory days, where there's going to come more measurement out of this period of time about performance metrics, about satisfaction, about everything from stress to productivity, new ways of looking at how things get done and how things got done well. Did patents applications go up, or did they go down? Did error rates go up or down? Did stress levels and doctor bills go up or down? It'd be a really curious time for us to look at that data and help that inform the next generation of workplace environments. Not just workplace environments, all environments, residential environments too, and third places. I mean, they are all a system.
And I think added to that, there is without doubt, you know, an incredible swelling of public communication about the things that we're just not happy with. We're not prepared to go back to it. And it's happening so fast across the world. You know, the speed of change, both in the global viral pandemic, but also in so many other matters, whether it's Black Lives Matters, the Me Too movement, the sustainability movement. You know, people are speaking out. They're connecting with one another. They're having their voices heard. They're getting out onto the street, albeit within the kind of the wider global threat. So without doubt, people are getting their messages out there, and organizations and some governments, I would say, are listening.
So how can we get the finance people behind incorporating some of these ideas that you're bringing up, so that it isn't perceived as added cost like it was before? That when you bring these things into the workplace that create greater enjoyment, greater refreshment, greater choice, greater interaction with people outside their network, that and even biophilia is debated. How can we convince the decision makers? Because I'm not seeing a lot of choice, a lot of decisions going in that direction now. Maybe it's where I'm looking and looking at real estate companies that are, you know, focused on the cleaning and distancing issues. But how do we make this perception of health and well-being not an added cost, that it is part of the bricks and mortar of how you run a business, how you build a business, the workplace that people work in. How do we do that?
Businesses are looking for results. So the better we can do at giving evidence and not looking as an expense, but as an investment with a return, the better we're all off. So this is that period of time where we might have much more rich data to explore about and all different parameters of productivity, healthfulness, turnover, hiring, what it means to the business. So the business people they're not in the business of hiring people. They're in the business of making a return on some investment. And if they can do that with fewer people, with more people, and then what does it take for people to be satisfied and be more productive in their work? They're very much looking at those. I think the biggest challenges right now are for the most resource-starved organizations, cities, hospitals, municipalities, stressed systems, governments, universities, anything that's relying on some sort of structured public financing are very challenged, and this is making it worse for them. So I think those are the organizations that are going to be most stressed by this, and they're going to have to be pretty creative. But they will first look at it as an expense because they are so resource starved. That's going to be a great challenge for those organizations.
In my mind, we've been long been talking about the business case for human-centered design, and it's really important that we start as designers to speak the language of our clients and to recognize that we are an expense to them and that we need to demonstrate the real value of what we're doing. So the evidence-based approach that underpins human-centered and biophilic design is really important, I think, to pique organizations' interest. There are so many research studies that are, for me, just absolutely fascinating in the demonstration of the value of access to natural light, to views, to the access to greenery, fresh air, the reduction of carbon dioxide in the air. Multiple studies that show how if you improve that, it can increase productivity, well-being, reduce absenteeism, negative costs. But I think that's relatively academic, and what is so important is that we start to analyze the real live projects, that we actually understand what's going on at the moment, that we create a baseline, that we undertake pre-occupancy evaluations, and once we create that baseline, we use that as a brief, and from that we have quantitative and qualitative data that really speaks of the grassroots opinion, not necessarily that top-down approach that we're so used to, but really about what's going on the ground and what people are feeling about working for an organization. And we need to use that as the brief, not necessarily just sort of talking to facilities managers about the building blocks of what's needed. And then once we've reacted to that brief, to re-measure in a post-occupancy evaluation to demonstrate the real value of what we as designers deliver. And we've got to get better at doing that. I think systems like the WELL standard kind of weave that into their mode of operations. So you've got to undertake pre and post occupancy evaluations on a regular basis to demonstrate the true value of putting human health and well-being right at the fore, and have that live data coming back about one's own buildings and one's own staff and occupants. And I think that's just so important about what we've got to do in the future.
Definitely. In fact, just to that's a great segue. I think we're all saying that place matters. And we see that as being top of mind with many in the design community. And Oliver, much to what you're saying with WELL standards and things along that line, and maybe even how we get more people on board with this that are not inside the industry, the financial people, Christina, that you've talked about, is that we've got to be able to identify and measure and show, I guess, results of some kind. So how can we start to identify and measure in terms of how well the built environment is responding to the needs of the individual? Is that through stuff like WELL, or are there other things?
Well, I think what's really key is what to measure. And I think pre-occupancy surveys, evaluations, they vary all over the map in terms of what their focus is. And I've been involved in a few POE creation and evaluation situations. And, IEQ, indoor environmental quality, is a stable a staple of these evaluations. But the question is, can they get at different questions that get at what behaviors result that they want to have in those spaces, and what experience they want people to have in those spaces. And then the designers have then, and the architects have the challenge of saying, well, how can we create those behaviors? How can we create that experience in ways that supports people's health, well-being, and productivity? And I think there's a gap between what we want people to do, how to behave, and how we build for that. For example, if we want people to experience joy, how do you build to that? If we want people to experience inspiration and the ability to innovate, how do you build for that? So I think there's more that has to be built between what will truly underlie health and well-being in built spaces, and what are the design qualities that have to go into those spaces in order to produce that result. And then we build it because we build it in, and then we have a post-occupancy that checks whether those behaviors have occurred or not. So I think the POE is a critical part of building it right.
It's critical, but not the only thing, right? So we've got, even if the environment is a good match with people's intended behaviors, or even leaders' opinion about behaviors that would bring success to an organization, people have to get emotionally invested in the mission too. So part of that is that the people feel vested, trusted, rewarded in their work, and that's where they will find joy, and they will, hopefully with colleagues, overcome challenges, and that's what leads to joy, right? That's what leads to individual and organizational success. You know, this whole notion that the place matters seems ridiculous that we're talking about it, because we're all sort of converted. We're in the place business. So, but when we do talk to clients, they think, well, it's an expense to be reduced. It's overhead. You know, can't we reduce our cost of occupancy? This is one of the most common things we encountered based on who commissions us. If it's a financial person, it's one thing. If it's an HR person, they might be much more in touch with individual satisfaction, right? So the commissioner, that point of view really matters when we start a project. But it's certainly not hard for us to think, you know what, we can pray anywhere, but we still go to church, right? We can have a beer at home, but it's much more fun to have a beer with friends at a tavern or at a winery or something. So place matters even in those simple examples. So because the connection with people and the context for those connections matter. So if we get people focused about all those behaviors and how they match up with the environment along with the mission, then people have their heart in it, the context has their behavior accommodated, then we have our best chance for success.
Yeah, so this is really a conversation about placemaking, isn't it? And helping people understand how to interpret what sort of functions a space might suggest. And I think when we create very flexible spaces that can be one thing or another, and they sort of end up failing because there's no clear ambition or delivery of the intended function. So placemaking is really important, and maybe that's about giving greater flexibility and understanding how the space should be used and what we want to deliver from it and what we want to get from it.
You know, it occurs to me that what we're talking about is something analogous to hardware and software, where, you know, hardware and software have to work together. The physical environment is the hardware, and the organizational practices, policies, procedures, so on, they're layered on top of that. Just like any device that's developed, you have to have both hardware and software. But what's interesting is there is an intersection between the two where it's fuzzy. Which part is the hardware part and which part can software take over, and vice versa? And, you know, we need both. And you're both talking about the combination of hardware and software. So how do we make this work better together? How much physical space should dictate the behaviors and experience of people, and then what software needs to be written that will be most compatible with that physical space. So I think it takes two.
I think there are some really interesting things going on with, sorry, one final thing, some amazing things going on with technology. I mean, obviously, we have the ability to measure, to quantify activity, occupation of spaces, to measure environmental qualities of acoustics, thermal, humidity issues within buildings. We've got building information modeling systems that are already set up. We can be integrating sensors into that, combining it with heart rate trackers and wearable technologies, and providing people are open to submitting data and location analysis. Then we do have enormous opportunities, and the things that we'll be able to do in now and into the not too distant future in terms of understanding the use of space and how people might interpret it and want to use it. I think it's really going to open up and become a very exciting area.
And I'm a big fan, and I really like the analogy, the hardware software analogy. Often we're talking to clients and saying, the facility or the building, it's never done. It's a continuum. So when was the last time you bought a computer and thought, good gracious, it's the last one I'll ever have to buy. I'll never have to upgrade. I'll never have to get more software. Well, of course, we never think that. We think it's a continuum. Our phones last 30 months, we get another one, we upgrade. We must think the same way about our facilities, that they have their own life, that they have to keep adapting and change. So back to Stuart Brand's theme of how buildings learn, Oliver's right. When we have spaces that are trying to design for any number of activities, we will soon have no placemaking at all. We'll have a hotel ballroom that will be generic and soulless. So we need opinions about space. They need to have opinions and a point of view. That's what establishes brand. That's what establishes connection to a group or to an audience. But in fact, those messages and those audiences change. So spaces we should commit to them. We should commit to the change. They should stay current to the intended behaviors, emotions, aptitudes, and attitudes.
It's a bit like plants. I mean, plants and nature, it's never static. It's always changing. It's always reacting to its environment. It's always just adapting. And buildings, in a way, don't necessarily need a central brain. They need to be constantly feeling and adapting in the right places and filling the gaps where there's sunlight and a desire to use space. So if we were to think more of buildings as plants and leaves and a diverse ecosystem, maybe we would have much more adaptive, suitable buildings to occupy.
Yeah, it needs to feel alive. Well,
yeah.
I definitely want to give our audience a chance to ask some questions. I wish we could keep going because this is so great. But Lauren, do you have any questions coming in from the audience? Or if not, does anybody have a question they would like to ask our panelists?
We do have one, Mindy, that came through a bit earlier. It says, hello and good afternoon. You've been talking about the disruptive aspects of the situation. Could you also talk about the positive aspects of the experience or the silver lining?
Okay,
yeah,
well, for me,
go ahead, Oliver.
My life has slowed down. I used to spend a lot of time traveling around Europe and the Middle East, giving lectures and seminars on biophilic design, and I was always traveling, and it was exhausting. And I didn't see my family enough, and I didn't tend to my garden enough. So, just being at home has meant that I can watch the gentle development of my plants, my gardens, the saplings. I can water them, I can nurture them, see those tiny little leaves develop into the kind of the bigger leaves, see the fruits develop, and there is this incredible sense of satisfaction of seeing the slower pace of life rather than just spending your life rushing around like a crazed non-stop wind-up toy. So I've got to say, I've had so much joy and satisfaction from that sort of slow nurturing of not just the plants in my life, but also, the subtle changes in my family and my children.
Great. Bill, you were going to say something.
Well, I'm a fan of disruption. Now, this is really an unwelcome type of disruption because a lot of people are really hurting. It's been devastating, but in fact, our big advancements have been because there was something disruptive event or technology where we can start to rethink things. And so we've been hearing a lot about going back to the new normal. And I recently heard someone say, let's talk about the new better, not the new normal. So what we had as normal before, maybe that wasn't so great. So the silver lining here might be like, let's rethink a lot of things. How can we make it better at home, at work, in between, the third place, multiple places? What's the matter with the Chicago company hiring someone in Fargo, North Carolina, or Fargo, or in Cary? Because it doesn't matter where you are if we have this. Not for every activity, but for many activities. So our range of who we can hire and where they do their work is going to be completely different. And I think I'm pretty optimistic about that, because I think that's going to give organizations and individuals more choice. And I think more choice is almost always a healthier environment.
I quite agree with that, that what we have is an opportunity to hit the reset button. And are we going to be clever enough to see where the forces of dragging us back to the past are overwhelming our urge to see a different future? I don't know where the leadership is going to come from. It feels very grassrooty, but I don't know that our voices are going to be strong enough, because I think we've all experienced some silver lining here where we've connected with our family in different ways, and we've stopped the craziness of being up in the air in an airplane flying to distant places. It's really perplexing to me to think about what is going to create the momentum going forward to create a better place, a better way of doing our lives. It's just so tempting to go back to the past. In fact, there's a lot of emphasis to going back to the past. And, do we need to start a movement? Do we need to lock arms and protest and say, nevermore, we're going to do this differently? What's it going to take? Because we truly have a reset button that we can push. Do we have the courage to do it?
We have had that time frame, haven't we, though? To give us the opportunity to experience what life might be like if it was different, because it's not as if it's just been a week or a weekend, but we properly experienced a duration of time in which we have, experienced a change in life. The reset button's been pressed. How can life be different? We can see that we can live. And I think providing we can find ways of attuning and connecting with people and having those sort of much needed social connections, whether it's with families or friends, within colleagues and organizations, then if we can make those work for us, we've had that experience and we can see that it can work.
Yeah, there's been a lot of suffering too. This has really brought out inequality to its most clearest form in so many ways. So there's a lot that we don't want to reproduce in the future. To working parents at home with a bunch of children who need to be schooled, and aging parents, and loss of job, loss of income, loss of business. So this is bigger than just going back to the office. It's really about how are we going to reshape society.
I agree with that. I do think this is a time to rethink affordability of cities and space, the lack of green in cities. How many playgrounds have been roped off that kids cannot play at in cities? And so if we agree with a lot of the thinkers out there that we're at the beginning of an age of pandemics, then this is our our beta test. Like what's the next design of our cities and our lives look like for the next event? It may be a different kind of pandemic, a different virus, but in fact, this isn't the first. Let's assume it's not the last. So we can do better. But I think affordability, public transportation, green space are really big, hairy issues that none of us can deal with individually, but there's great pressures on those things being rethought and hopefully redesigned.
You know, Lauren, we probably have time for one more question if we have one, but we're about 3 minutes to the top of the hour. So is anything else coming in question-wise?
Yes, there was one more question around specific studies that show the benefit of biophilic design, wellness, etc. So I think we could pose that to all three if you have ideas about where people can find good resources.
Yeah. Well, if it's specifically about biophilic design, we've written a number of white papers alongside Interface called Creating Positive Spaces. The idea about it is to demonstrate, in part, the business case for it. So there are lots and lots of studies that demonstrate the value to different building typologies, including the workplace, hospitality, healthcare, and education. And then we look at how the ideas can be implemented into buildings in different cost strategies, from low cost to medium, and then to high cost. So if you Google or other search engines available, Interface and Creating Positive Spaces white papers, you'll find those and download them. There's lots and lots of research studies in there, and the references are also included.
We also published a book this September called How to Build to Thrive, How to Build the Best Workplaces for Health, Wellbeing, and Productivity. Shameful plug for the book, but it is filled with evidence supporting the development of workstations, how to design for emotion, how to assess environments in terms of its health and well-being, and so on. So you can check out our website to get some information on the book, but it was designed to load it full of the evidence, including biophilic design.
Great. And I'll put one plug. I have no relation other than we've enjoyed working on some projects together. Is the Leesman Index, the Leesman database, UK-based organization, but they're looking at some really important measures. Actually, they now have a work from home module, as well as mostly employee satisfaction. What are the measures that matter, drivers and what they call super drivers that matter in people's productivity and satisfaction with their workplace? Really important work. It's quickly growing, so do participate in that and stay current on their work.
Great. Okay, so we are at the end. I want to thank all of you for attending today's episode of the Interface Adaptation series, and a special thanks to our panelists for such a rich discussion. Today's broadcast and the full series have been recorded and are available at interface.com, so be sure to check those out if you missed the first 2 episodes. Thank you all.
Thank you.
Thank you.